we have our friends at New Riff standing by. But those of you that are in the area that went out and got the first, what we're doing at this section is we're actually going to be, we're going to taste the bourbon that's in your kit that you picked up. So New Riff is a wonderful local distillery that actually has a new riff or a new style of approaching the bourbon industry. So I would like to introduce our guest from New Riff, Jay Erisman. 30 years of passionate study in whiskey led Jay to co-found New Riff Distilling in Newport, Kentucky, where he serves today as Vice President of Strategic Development, head blender, distiller, and four-string truck driver. From 2001 to 2014, Jay ran the groundbreaking fine spirits and education program at iconic Kentucky liquor retailer, the Party Source, working closely with Kentucky's bourbon distilleries to create new whiskeys. As a whiskey writer, Jay's work has appeared in Whiskey Advocate and Distiller, among other publications. So, Jay, you're gonna show us how to go about doing this, right? Do it the right way?
Thank you, Scott. Yes, be happy to do so. The short answer is you raise the glass to your lips and pour it in your mouth. But we're going to go over a little more than that, I think. So thank you for having us. My name's Jay, and welcome to New Riff Distilling. May I chime in on our keynote speaker and our upcoming bourbon historian, that we're keenly aware of history here at New Riff. We are, as it says on the back of the bottle, and as we say here, a new riff on an old tradition. And we are keenly aware of the new, but also the old. In fact, this building we are in is a great example of preservation and restoration. Our production plant, which is located at the very far northeast corner of Newport, right in front of the Party Source, is a blindingly beautiful, may I say so myself, modern piece of modern architecture. But this facility we're in West Newport, this is at the very southwest corner of the city of Newport, is a over 100-year-old building. Used to house a streetcar company called the Green Line, and we have restored and rescued this property. It's been warehousing our bourbon for 7 years, and today it houses a warehouse in the back. It has our bottling line, our cased goods inventory, things like that. This is a processing facility, and we've maintained the historical character of the building. So we are keenly aware and passionate about saving and repurposing the things that are out there. And this facility has to date matured very many medals that we have won in competitions around the country. So about our whiskey, to some more historical notes, this is our Riff Bottled and Bond Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey, as it says here in the bottle, bottled and bond without filtration. Bottled and bond, by the way, is one of, when we talk about new riffs on old traditions, bottled and bond is maybe the greatest bourbon tradition of them all. It dates from 1897, when the Bottled and Bond Act was the first product protection or product sort of delimiting legislation in America. How American of us, by the way, that the first thing we protected was not the baby food, not the aspirin, it was the whiskey. Protect the whiskey first. And since 1897, Bottled and Bond is the highest standard for quality for a brown aged spirit in the whole wide world. And so that is why everything we make at New Riff gets a Bottled and Bond designation, with the exception of our single barrel products, which are stronger than are allowed for Bottled and Bond. Belaying all that, this has a local connection as well. The prime mover for the Bottled and Bond designation, the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897, was a man named John G. Carlisle, a Covington native. He is buried here in Covington, and a local boy, if you will. He served as a Kentucky state senator and also as Secretary of the Treasury at the time when they were putting this act into legislation. And he is the one who moved it through Congress, who shepherded this act that protected and upheld Kentucky bourbon whiskey. So we think of him as really the founder of this very high quality standard that we maintain. It all came out of Northern Kentucky. So as to tasting this bourbon, I enjoy adding, by the way, a little bit of water to it. Now, you can drink it any way you want. I've been saying for 20 years, drink your whiskey any way you want, just buy it from me. That said, I like to add a little bit of water. And if we pour just a trickle of water in here like this, we'll see some beautiful oils swim around in the glass as we do that. That is smoothness. You can see these oils are part of the flavor and even the texture of bourbon. And commonly they are filtered away a little bit and attenuated. And we preserve them by being an unchill filtered bourbon. On top of that, our bourbon is, as it says on the back of the bottle, 30% rye. The mash bill is 65% corn, 30% rye, and 5% malted barley. That 30% rye, very high rye mash bill, one of the highest in the industry. And that accounts for our whiskey having a lot of flavor. This is not mild, easygoing. This is full flavored and very spicy and intense whiskey. We're going to taste in a little while how it stands up in a cocktail as well. But for now, to taste it, as they say in wine, it's showing well tonight. There's a textural component to New Riff that I really am pleased that we can bring to the whiskey. Texturally, it is broad. It spreads across your whole mouth. Part of that is down to being 100 proof because it's bottled in bond. Part of it is, a lot of it is down to being unchill filtered. But the genesis of that mouthfeel, that richness, actually comes from the water that we put into this whiskey. Underneath our distillery, 100 feet below the surface, there in the corner of Newport, is an aquifer. We found a native ground source, a native groundwater that provides cooling water for the distillery, and thus it provides a tremendous green energy savings for us. But it also is the water that becomes the whiskey. And that water has about 4 times the dissolved minerality that we find in the typical tap water of the region. That aquifer is fed partly by the river, but mostly by the hills that lay to the south of here. The hills that ring northern Kentucky are full of limestone, and those hills send their groundwater down into this aquifer and help become New Riff. So I'm certain that this big, rich flavor that we are renowned for begins with our not only local water source, but a primeval water source, a source right out of the ground, right under our very feet, that becomes New Riff whiskey. I hope you like it, Scott.
Now that I'm unmuted, I can tell you how much I like it. Yes, thank you very much. I know everyone's enjoying it. New Riff is also a wonderful neighbor to all of our communities, very much involved. Also makes like the best bourbon anywhere in Kentucky. So
Why, thank you.
Here's to all of you at home who have joined us. Jay, thank you for sharing this with us. Stay tuned. After we hear from Nick Laracuente, we will be back on with the Manhattan. So thank you, Jay.
My pleasure.
All right. Well, I guess, is it over to me? I think somebody's on mute. All right. Well, I'll get going then. So, my name's Nick Laracuente. I'm the bourbon archaeologist in the distilling industry. I've been doing bourbon archaeology now for going on 10 years or so. And I've probably talked with a lot of the folks that are on the call a few times in the past. I was thinking about the last time that I came up to the Covington area and did a talk. I think it was over in Newport, and I think the focus was mostly on the discovery of bourbon Pompeii over at Buffalo Trace. So I figured I would mix things up a little bit today and talk about some of the smaller distillery work, the stuff that I really got my start with. when I started looking at old forgotten distilleries. And I think there's a lot of commonalities with stuff that folks have been talking about today, right? To be a bourbon fan is also a very good bridge into preservation. As Jay was just talking about, you have a lot of adaptive reuse that you see in a lot of different distilleries, in the aging warehouses. It's something where the industry is authentic, it's pure. It also pays homage to the past in several different ways, both through the way the whiskey is made, but also through the buildings, the landscape, all of that that is used, right? So we're going to talk a lot about farm distilleries, a little bit of industrial distilleries, and some moonshine sites today. Let me share my screen. There we go. So if you're interested more in Bourbon Pompeii, we can talk about that in Q&A, but I'm only going to kind of scratch the surface of it here today. The thing that I wanted to talk about mostly is a little bit of how bourbon is made, the general whiskey history in Kentucky, and then I wanted to get into the 3 tiers of distilling: industrial distilleries, farm distilleries, moonshine sites. Because no matter where you are in Kentucky, and even a little bit outside the states into Ohio, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, you're going to see the same pattern repeating over and over and over. And it's just a matter of finding the right type of site, the right group to take a closer look at that and unpack some history. And we'll talk a little bit about how to do that. So on the screen, you see a small abandoned industrial distillery. It's the Fraser Distillery, Woodford County. If anybody's seen the documentary Neat, a bourbon film, this is the site that we were at. I believe this was actually taken during the filming of that little segment where we're featured in Neat. So to get everyone on the same page, it looks like there's several dozen of us in attendance right now, and I don't want to assume everybody on the call is a bourbon expert, but you've probably at least been on a tour or two. No matter where you are, roughly, in Kentucky's history, you're going to have a few different stages of distilling that show up the same time, the same way every single time, right? Whiskey in itself is a combination of grain and water. You let it ferment. The fermentation tanks, they look different depending on if you're working with a small farm distillery or a moonshine site. In this case, this is a picture of the copper-lined fermentation vat at Bourbon Pompeii in the kind of finished exhibit area. And you can see that if you happen to go by there on a tour today. After it sits for a little bit and the yeast gets in there and starts eating the sugars and starches, outputting alcohol, you add heat in a copper still. The alcohol separates from the water. It condensates into a white liquid. It's a new make whiskey, White Dog. If you're not paying your taxes on it, you can call it moonshine at that point. But it's clear, just like the water in your glass, but it's very high proof. Usually after this point, that liquid, the White Dog, is extremely flammable. And depending on where we are in Kentucky's history, you see a lot of different disasters. Things like Kentucky River being set on fire, or different warehouses that kind of collapse in flame. There was one, James E. Pepper distillery down in Lexington, that the warehouse collapsed. Part of the creek nearby caught on fire, and they had a problem because they were trying to put out the fire while people were trying to go in and collect whiskey that's like in the barrels and have themselves a drink. And that sort of story happens again and again and again throughout Kentucky. It's interesting. But disasters are usually pretty good for archaeology. We'll talk about that in a little bit, about why. Then you see sometimes, depending on where we are in Kentucky's history, you see aging of whiskey. Right now, it's almost a given. You're going to see the warehouses. We're going to be talking about how many years goes into the bourbons that we prefer, right? Is a sweet spot 4 years, 10 years, whatever. Earlier in Kentucky's history, you have maybe this step doesn't exist or it looks a little bit different. The very early distilleries, say early 1800s or so, they're not really putting bourbon into barrels every single time. Sometimes it's going into stoneware jugs. There is no char layer that's making any kind of like dark color or the flavors that we're associating with bourbon today. Instead, you have something that's very much like White Dog, and you see it used in different ways depending on what's going on locally. The other interesting thing is if you check out Sanborn maps of almost any distillery around Kentucky, you'll see there's a response to that potential for disaster. Keep in mind, of course, they're fire insurance maps, right? But you start to see the landscape of these distilleries intentionally designed to minimize the threat of losing your product. You'll see trenches, you'll see arrows marked on a map that says whiskey flow in that direction from this warehouse, with the idea that if one collapses, it doesn't start a chain reaction over time. You see in just different areas of Kentucky that problem is handled in very different ways. Over at what is now the O.Z. Tyler distillery, they actually have kind of sub basements in the underneath the warehouses with the idea that the whiskey would drop straight down. I'm not entirely sure if it would actually work that way, depending on what exactly happened, but that's one of the reasons these things are built that way. And it's interesting to see how it varies. So throughout time, whether you're looking at things like say like New Riff, or you're looking at James Pepper, you're looking at an old moonshine site here somewhere in Appalachia, it's the same process, but you have very different scales of what's going on, right? So even though that process stays the same, the place that bourbon holds in our society is very different depending on what's going on with a variety of social, political, technological factors. And that's a whole different class. If you want to go into detail on that, you can join me in my bourbon history class at Midway. We're doing another one in the spring, I believe. We go in detail. 16 weeks of very fun history. So in the very beginning, think like late 1700s, early 1800s, no matter where you are in Kentucky, distilling is not a luxury, it's an economic necessity. A lot of places in Kentucky do not have good roads. You can't get your grain out to market before it spoils and goes bad and you've just wasted a crop. So a lot of the distillers are bringing in stills, or they have friends with stills, right? So you're turning your corn into whiskey. It stays good longer, and it's more money per volume whenever you're shipping out a bunch of stoneware jugs full of your product, getting it to market, putting it on flatboats, moving it down the river, what have you. So very interesting things going on there. But the whiskey's a little volatile at that time, right? We're more or less operating on a barter economy where that whiskey, yes, it's getting out to market, but you can also trade gallons of whiskey for things like help with barn raising, help with selling land, things like that. One of the distilleries we'll look at here in a minute was actually sold in about 1803 or so in exchange for 1,400 gallons of whiskey that the folks that it was being sold to would make, right? Over time, moving into about the 1820s or so, we move out of a barter economy into more of a cash economy in Kentucky. You start to see the rise of brands, you start to see standardization. So you see things like labs pop up throughout the distilleries, sour mash process, and all of that sort of thing starts happening. That rise in brands is where you start to get some of the split between industrial distilleries, folks that are putting out a large volume of alcohol for the purpose of getting it to market, and small farm distilleries where they're just trying to process their grain, right? So we'll come back to this in a little bit, but this is one of the fun pictures from a lab in a building I worked at Buffalo Trace. Then, of course, there's taxes, which are still a problem today, I believe. Although I guess the latest problem has been tariffs and such. But it recurs in cycles throughout the history of the United States. The government always wants to take a cut, and it is another thing that drives a wedge between industrial distillers and small farm distillers in the 1800s. You always see a rise in taxes in order to pay for different wars. There's definitely a spike right in the late 1700s. There's a spike for War of 1812, Civil War. There's impacts of World War I and II on the distilling industry, maybe not in taxes, but in other aspects. But the idea of taxing your barrels, again, changes over time, but it dramatically changes how people go about distilling, both in, say, moonshine sites starting to pop up in order to avoid taxes, or the way things are aged. The Bottled and Bond Act that Jay was talking about a minute ago, part of the impetus for that was folks realized they could skip paying a few years of taxes if they skipped the barrel aging process and just took some of their white dog and doctored it. They would add things like a little bit of cochineal. It's a red beetle. When you crush it up, it adds a nice dye and gets your clear whiskey pretty dark pretty quick. You can add some burnt sugar, maybe some tobacco, maybe some leather, and you're starting to get some of the notes you have with an aged bourbon, right? But you can get there even faster if you add things like creosote or hydrochloric acid in order to get some burn in there. And it will burn, but it'll probably only burn maybe one time. So the impetus for the Bottled and Bond Act was to get some of that under control, because the people that were following the rules and doing it right, their reputations were being destroyed by the folks that were taking those shortcuts. And you see that again in cyclical patterns throughout the history of the United States, where folks blame whiskey for all of the different societal ills that you could ever encounter, right? You actually see this in archival documents from Thomas Jefferson. He's writing to his compatriots about taxes, and he's saying that one of the reasons I want to raise taxes on whiskey and lower taxes on wine is whiskey is associated with all these lower class problems. If we make that harder to get, and wine, a high class alcohol, easier to get, will magically cure some of the problems that we have in our society. We see this in different places. Of course, maybe the climax, I suppose you could say, of that is the grand experiment, the prohibition, a very dark time in our lives, I believe. Here, you definitely see an impact to the whiskey distilling industry, not only through all of the chopping up of stills and the medical licenses for liquor and such, but whenever prohibition ends, that need to age bourbon for a little bit to get that good flavor, the stuff that we're looking for, right? Whenever we crack into an excellent whiskey, excellent bourbon, that lag in time means that the clear liquors, the gins, the vodkas, etc., they take over. And it's a very, very dark time in our history when people are moving toward the gins and moving away from the bourbon. Fortunately, things have gotten better, so that's good. So, distillery tiers, I've mentioned it a few times. So when I first started this, I got into a lot of the popular history books you could find on bookstore shelves, like Michael Veitch's book, Fred Minnick, a few others. And if you look at the types of distilleries that are being described there, they're focusing on the big names, the E.H. Taylors, the Stitzel-Wellers, all of those are basically talking about industrial distilleries. Michael Veitch, he takes a minute to talk about farm distilleries. I think it's like on page 36 of his book. He's got a paragraph. It's a small 100-gallon still used by farmers. We don't know that much about it. We have a few recipes associated with it, but other than that, we need to learn more. And we have learned a little bit more since then. Moonshine stills are basically blanket, everything is illegal is defined as moonshine, even though any of us that have watched the moonshiners, or maybe we've gone to the Neely distillery or any of these other things, we know there is a wide variety in what moonshine looks like, what's going on, what causes it. And we'll talk a little bit about that with some of the archaeological investigations of moonshine here in a minute. So these are both distilleries. You got the old Granddad plant in Frankfurt. You got the Epler distillery, run by two brothers and their spinster sister in Woodford County, Kentucky, making and supplying whiskey locally. People liked it. If you're outside of Woodford County, you're not really hearing anything about them. They're both distilleries. They're both making whiskey. One of them has a gigantic sign on it, so it's really easy to identify it as a distillery. The other one was a dot on a map in 1870s Woodford County. So the question that I started with was, how do you tell the difference between a pile of rock and an actual distillery? Do you have a small family home, or do you actually have a still in this area? And that's where I started looking at other archaeological projects done throughout the United States. Of course, all roads kind of lead back to Mount Vernon. George Washington's distillery is probably one of the most thoroughly excavated and thoroughly studied. They got enough information to be able to rebuild on a site. And if you have a chance to go out there, you can see what Steve Bayshore is doing with the recreations of the George Washington rye. And I think you're doing some brandy and some other things out there. It's awesome. What they did was they looked at that particular site not as like a single collection of like, here's some artifacts, this is exactly where the distillery is. These things are spread over acres sometimes. So they looked back at those steps, the fermentation, the distillation, where people live, that sort of thing. And they're like, what are the material signatures that go along with this, right? As a good example, here is one of the still displays I've seen on the Bourbon Trail. And if you're thinking about that archaeologically, that still is probably going to disappear because it's valuable. You salvage it, you resell it. But as it's used, as it's rusting, maybe you get some copper flaking coming off the top, right? So underneath there, you got the fire. So you're probably going to have a baked area in the ground. A lot of the ground here in Kentucky is very clayey. So you would definitely have maybe like a red, hard baked stain, a little bit of that stone possibly left at the bottom, and maybe a little halo, a little green metal halo of that metal kind of flaking off. You can find that with a metal detector that is geared to take out all of the ferrous hits, and you're only looking for cuprous hits. And you can find bits and pieces of copper and narrow down like what part of the distillery you're looking for. So if we look at, here's two distilleries, and for size comparison, you've got Buffalo Trace and you've got the Epler distillery, but this one is magnified in scale by about 3. If this was 1-to-1, it would probably, this whole distillery, the house, the distilling site, the place where they're bottling, would probably fit inside one of these warehouses, right? So if you're thinking about these feature systems, they appear the same way in these two different size of distilleries. You got the mashing fermenting, you got the distillation that's not too terribly far away. In the small farm distillery, this is actually built on the side of a hill. So they do their mashing fermenting, they put it in a wagon, they take it down this road up on top of the hill, and they dump it into the top of the still up here and use gravity for the rest of the process to help it along. You got your storage. So at Buffalo Trace, it's all of those warehouses, right? Here in the Epler distillery, they are distilling it, they're putting it in the stoneware jug, they're getting it out to market. There is really no storage and aging on this site. You have bottling. So bottling hall here, since I took this picture off of Google Earth, I believe a new bottling hall has been built. But here in Epler Distillery, there is a little cache of broken stoneware jugs in this area, giving us an idea of that's probably where the whiskey was packaged at that site. We have distribution, so big rig trucks in a new distillery. The Kentucky River, for a lot of these other distilleries, there is a wagon trail going about, I don't know, half a mile, maybe a mile down the creek to where the Kentucky River's down in this area in relation to Epler. If you were anywhere else in Kentucky, look for one of those navigable waterways, and a lot of your early stills are probably going to be located fairly close in order to get out to the Ohio and out to the global market over time. Office and maintenance areas, because fixing this equipment to maintaining what's going on is always a constant problem. You also have administration. Here on the Epler side, it might have just been the house. We're not entirely sure about that yet. And then, of course, residential. You don't really see that in these industrial sites because they're specialized work areas. Most of the artifacts you find here only have to do with distillation. They don't really have to do with, say, eating dinner or raising kids or anything like that. Here on the Epler site, we found a little bit of everything. We found some of their china, a little bit of what they were eating. We found personal decorative jewelry from the sister Sally Ann as she's walking a kind of a stoneway path over here to the actual distillation area. There's like a brooch and some other things that we found that speaks to her existence. So this area right here, to get kind of dirty and into some of the excavations, it is indicative of how hard it is to work on industrial distilleries. These things are very complicated. They change a lot over time. So this particular one used to be a butcher shop. It was where the time clock was. It was the doctor's house. It was that lab that was in a picture from a few moments ago. It became the unofficial break room. Lots of planks over the floor, and there was like beer cans stashed underneath this thing when we had an opportunity to dig at it before it was excavated. So the thing with this archaeologically, because we're looking for these closed contexts, as a lot of you have probably heard at other conferences and stuff. Whenever you have something that's like a layer cake and you're able to go back in time and pick out those little bits and tell the story about that part in the past, that's a good thing. On the industrial sites, everything's constantly chewed up because technology is always changing. The need for the function of these buildings is always changing. So these sites are in constant flux over time. So I moved away from these sites in general to the small farm distilleries. So here at the Jewett House, this is a little bit of serendipity happening here. Right when I began the bourbon archaeology research, I was doing it as a PhD project. I've moved away from it since then. I used to be on the board of this historic house site. I started talking about my work a little bit, and they're like, well, in addition to Jewett being this Revolutionary War hero who happened to retire in Woodford County and was a politician and agriculturalist and all of this stuff, he was also a distiller, but we don't really know that much about it. We interpret the house. We have no idea where his actual still was. But what we do have are these lawsuit documents that talk about his presence in the distilling industry. Jack, he started his distillery in 1794, and he sold it in 1803 when he moved to Bath County and started another distillery up in that area. He sold that distillery for 1,400 gallons of whiskey to Peter and Charles Buck. And then the lawsuit started because Peter and Charles Buck never paid him. The lawsuits span about 10 years or so. There's lots of name calling back and forth. There was one witness to their handshake agreement on this, and the day that he was to be deposed, he showed up just absolutely sloshed. They said that they couldn't understand him because he drank too much of the product that Peter and Charles Buck were making. And so they just tossed his entire testimony out. In addition to fun stories like that, though, there's lots and lots of details about where this distillery is. It talks about near the mouth of Craig's Creek. It has all of these different components. It has some places where grain's cooked, where like the milling happens, where the distillation happens. It also has some other details about the mash bill. He was supposed to be providing this proportion of grain to Peter and Charles Buck. And so we actually have a general idea of how this was made. It's actually a mash bill that's pretty close to Old Granddad as far as bourbons that are available in the market today. So we went looking for it. We got in the creek, we followed the directions that were in that map, and we actually found it. So this is a LiDAR map. It's a topographical map made by lasers of the area. This is Craig's Creek going down through here. Bluegrass Parkway is this kind of smooth line here on the side. And here in the middle, cutting through Craig's Creek, is the mill race for Jewett's distillery site. So diverting the water, running his actual grist mill wheel, processing his corn down here in this holler. You have two different foundations of stone buildings. You got historic roads that crisscross the site, and then you have these things that appear to be cattle, hog pens, things like that that are on the back hill. And if you look at the early distilling manuals, this is always a component of the early distilleries. They say if you have a still that's 100 gallons, buy 30 head of hog because you can feed them well off of the spent mash, and then you supplement your income in order to stay afloat financially as you're distilling. So since we found it, we went ahead and we put an ad in the paper, since it is a historic house site and we wanted to have a public event. And the ad went something like, if you like whiskey, if you like Jack Jewett, you like archaeology, and you want to come help us look for him, just show up at this time. Over the course of the year, we had 130 people join us, all to get their hands dirty, and they all had a differing interest with being in the woods or the artifacts or Jewett or whatever. But this project had brought these varying interests together, and they were able to see how the histories relating to the archaeologies, relating to the bourbon, is relating to the tourism aspects of keeping something like a historic house site alive and kicking. So on the site itself, this is the mill race. You can see this log over the edges here to give you an idea of how deep it is. It's a little hard to see at different times of the year when it gets all overgrown and whatnot. The 130 people, we dug something like 170 holes across the site. These are the two buildings. The red dots are where we actually found stuff. And we've recovered something like 1,722 artifacts over the course of that year. Ironically, there was absolutely nothing inside the two house foundations. And we think the reason for that is that you don't really work in a cluttered, like the floor being cluttered workspace. You don't want to shuffle through trash. Maybe you are tripping before you're getting ready to reglaze your window, or you're trying to do some other things. You've lost your tool before you're working on that engine that Scott was talking about earlier. In the case of this, you want to keep that floor clean so you're not contaminating maybe your fermenting mash, you're not causing some sort of accident in the actual distillery proper, which we believe is this building right here. So since it was a small volunteer project, well, I guess relatively small volunteer project, we concentrated where the artifacts were in order to tell what was going on in this part of the site. For anybody that's an archaeology nerd out there, this is the sole profile of what was going on in that area. Ground surface is here. You've got a little bit of artifacts in this area, but you had a dark midden, a lot of burning, a lot of artifacts about this deep down before you got to subsoil. So we opened up a larger unit to see what was going on in that area. Here's a profile of it. You can see ground surface. This area had four-wheelers going through it. So these are actually four-wheeler ruts in the top few inches of the ground surface. A little bit of erosion, flood deposits, things like that. And then a perfectly capped and sealed cooking pit that had remnants of kitchen utensils, forks, things like that. It had a carbonized remnant of one of their last meals. You can actually see where this piece of bone, it was boiled, kind of like a ham hock and soup beans, right? But you can actually see the knife marks here where they're getting the meat off of it during that meal while they're taking a break. Maybe they're cooking while folks are distilling. They're getting ready to feed the crew. And that's how we're interpreting this area, almost like a break zone. These are the types of artifacts we're finding there. Buttons off of people's clothing, jaw harp here for playing music while you're waiting. And we only found really one piece of a stoneware jug in the actually distilling area. And we believe the reason for this is probably that these things are expensive. It was hard to get this stuff out into this remote area in the early 1800s or so. And so if you have somebody that's kind of butterfingers on the crew, maybe they're only making one accident before you move them into like a different type of job. And that's why we're not really seeing a lot of the stoneware jugs left behind on these sites. So it's hard to get at because we're not digging up full gallons of whiskey, like bottles. We're not finding copper hydrometers or stuff like that. Instead, we're looking at it in activity areas. We have to compare it with other knowns, right? We'll get to that idea here in a moment with Epler Distillery. But sometimes in looking at these sites, it isn't about the artifacts. That's cool. Yes, digging is sexy. Getting out and getting bit up by mosquitoes and chiggers and snakes and stuff is always a lot of fun. But sometimes the point, just like bourbon, is to slow down and look at a place a few times and appreciate what's there. With this particular site, as we started digging into it, and as the 130 people brought their varying expertise to it, we had somebody that was really into going through old newspapers, and they actually found this 1817 ad in the Lexington Reporter. It was a very short run newspaper. I think it was only maybe 5 years. And this is an ad where Jack is selling his enslaved crew in order to get out of the bankruptcy that he found himself in. The text of the letter, whenever you get really close and you get your magnifying glass and all of that, it actually talks about he's got a carpenter, a leather worker, and one of the finest distillers that you will ever find in Kentucky here for sale. So there is another deeper story here that we're starting to unpack through more documentary research rather than digging with a shovel and brush. So there's lots of that going on, but right now we're in the point of we're starting to compare. We're taking some of this evidence, looking at the distillers, the distilleries. We're bringing actual folks that work in distilling out to some of these places to talk about, if you are going to be making whiskey here, how does this work? Does this interpretation of the site work? We're also comparing it with other places, like this farm distillery that I mentioned before, the Epler Distillery. It's run about 50 years later from the Jewetts, and is more or less the same setup. It's a few haulers over, it goes into the Kentucky River, it's built on the side of a hill. And this is a much more blown up map than what we were looking at a minute ago. You've got your two-pen house here for the residential element. You got lots of residential kitchen, personal artifacts around there. And then this is more or less the distilling area. They have a way of controlling water, unlike the Jewett site that was completely dependent on Craig's Creek running all the time. There's a natural spring coming out of the side of the hill here, and you can still see the trenches that connect the spring to these different buildings. And there's different things like stone that's built up to keep that water in place. You also have remnants of the actual grist mill down here in this area, but this is a site that we're looking at right now. So still doing some work here, trying to figure out what's going on with it. So grist mill, distilling area, and the residential area over here. Kentucky River in that direction. This is what that area looks like. You can see that trench I was talking about here, some of the old piers in this area. And up here where Brandon and Kate are, you could actually, this is where some of the stoneware jugs were found in the distilling area. Again, I mean, without coming at it with this kind of model, these different lines of evidence, just looking at these piles of stone, it would be hard to say, hey, I'm looking at a distillery here. So One last here, moonshine sites. I haven't spent a lot of time myself looking at them, but I've been looking at the research of folks who are. Now, these are slightly different from the industrial sites, from the farm distillery sites, because both of those are legal and they're trying to get the whiskey produced in different ways to get it out to market, right? With your moonshine sites, the primary purpose for these things existing is, yes, to make whiskey, but also to hide itself from law enforcement. You're going to find them in very strange places. One of them in Daniel Boone National Forest was actually up underneath an overhang of one of the rock shelters. There's no water around it at all. The only time that they are actually able to distill is whenever it's raining. You've got water coming off of the drip lines and filling up your stills, and you're able to distill during, like, say, thunderstorms and whatnot. The late Timothy Smith and Tom DeJean, um, they spent some time in 2010 looking at a collection of a few hundred moonshine sites throughout Big South Fork, so southern Kentucky, northern Tennessee. And they actually found a site where this is a very small footprint here. It's smaller than any of the other distilleries. And without the pictures here, again, all you would have is some stone, right? But they were able to look at the artifacts, say, all right, these are the components that we have here. But they were also able to access a bunch of oral histories talking about what was going on in that particular holler. Everybody knew that the guys were up here making their product. They were supportive of it. And then there's interesting stories, and it's supplemented by the artifacts where they bring everything in, and in order to hide what they're doing there, whenever they're done at the end of the day, they walk out and they're tossing the random things they're using, like lard buckets or mason jars or what have you. They're tossing it just down the holler. So they have this, the whole holler is just littered with garbage, except for this side that's relatively clean. It's a very different way of artifacts being deposited. It's interesting. There's a lot here to unpack. You can actually find this paper if you just Google for Timothy Smith, Tom DeJean, moonshine in Big South Fork, and you can find it to read for yourself online. Lots of fun things happening there. And if anybody is up for a road trip, you can Google Catherine Parker, moonshine. I can send the link to Jody and Scott so they can share with the conference attendees. But Catherine is actually working on a project in South Carolina at the moment, looking at some moonshine stills, and she's running it the way that I did the Jewett project. Anybody that's interested can join her, go excavate on these sites, get their hands on like artifacts that were last used in moonshining. And she's going to be running that project through the summer this year. So there's always more, right? If you want to see more details on what's going on with this model that I was just discussing, you could find this book from University of Alabama Press. I've got a chapter in there talking about the 3 tiers of distilling and going into much, much more detail on what's going on with the artifacts and such. If you want to get me for other talks, or you can go to distilled-living.com, or if you want to come and take 16 weeks of bourbon history, join me and Tim Niddle in the Bourbon Studies program at Midway University. You can always find me there as well. And I wanted to, on the subject of university professor and stuff like that, Jay actually gave me some homework when I was talking to him earlier this week. And I had mentioned to him, like, we can go on and, focus on there's any aspects of distilling. I can unpack something, what have you. And he's like, well, how about some history of what's going on in Northern Kentucky? And so I'm finding a few stories like what he was talking about with Carlisle and the Bottle and Bond Act. But I like to think I own nearly every single bourbon book that exists. And I was flipping through them and I noticed that a lot are focused on Louisville, Bardstown, maybe the Frankfurt area, where they talk about, say, the bourbon barons, the really big names. only two books that I found actually talk about the Covington Newport area around Cincinnati, what's going on from Maysville coming down through. You could find it in Bourbon Backroads, that was published in 2019 by Carl Rates, or you could find a lot on distilling in Northern Kentucky through Chester Zolder's book, Bourbon in Kentucky. But a more fun way to think about it, and this is where the homework comes in, and this is homework I'm going to do too, since we're getting into a little bit of normal right now, right? You can go outside, you can wear the mask or not, but we need to get cracking on redoing some bourbon passports and such. One excellent way to get accustomed to history, but also support adaptive reuse, bourbon industry, the historic preservation that kind of meshes with all of this, is to do the entire beeline. You can find it at whatyoursippingpoint.com or Google Beeline. And similar to the Bourbon Trail, there's definitely a passport. You can go to New Riff, you can go to Hotel Covington, you can go to all these different culinary experiences that are part of the Beeline. And like most of our bourbon tourism industry, we can literally taste our way through history, picking up little tidbits here and there while we get out and actually see some of this industry that's still a major driver of our economy in Kentucky. So I'm going to be doing that in 2021, and hopefully I can run into some of you all while I'm out there and getting my stamps on my Beeline passport. So before we go into questions, I actually want to turn this back over to Jay so we can have a little drink of our Manhattans and such, and then we can go into Q&A while we do that. All yours, Jay.
Right on, Nick. Thank you. Yes, and thank you for doing your homework. I hope you all are taking notes. Nick and I will be presenting a quiz after the event here, and we expect straight A's from all of our students. So, a New Riff cocktail of all time, and we're using, of course, New Riff Kentucky straight bourbon, whiskey, bottled and bond without chill filtration. The vermouth we have tonight, and I believe our participants tonight enjoy a kit, and that's what we will be mixing this with, these little samples that we have. But this vermouth that we have is Cochi, C-O-C-C-H-I. It's from one of my very favorite vermouth, and quite affordable. Definitely a step up from your garden variety vermouth. So the Manhattan was 1780s. It is part of the family of cocktails that incorporate and American cocktail scene, and a whole bunch of classic cocktails revolve around this theme of vermouth, right? Gin and dry vermouth. So that's what we're riffing on here tonight. So using a little kit that we have here, like you do at home, we're going to pour in 2 and half an ounce of our vermouth. And if you'd like it a little sweeter, a little drier, you can add perfect Manhattan, which one would reasonably have to be. Actually, not the meaning of a perfect Manhattan. Perfect Manhattan, and I like a Manhattan like this now and then, is one that is made of equal parts dry and sweet vermouth together. So if you 50-50 the vermouth, you wind up with a quote-unquote perfect Manhattan. And I like it that way too. It's kind of fun to drink that way. I like that. Just a few drops of we normally would have a bottle of, but here we have just little samples, just a little bit of bitters that go in there. Please don't skip the bitters. I recall in our years at operating the Party Source, I would have the archetypal customer for a Manhattan was often a pretty old guy, and he would come in and say, "Sonny, where's the bottled and bond?" and get a case of Gallo vermouth. And he wanted the cheapest vermouth he could possibly get, and it went with bottled and bond whiskey. I never had one of those guys order bitters as well. I don't think they put bitters in there, but bitters is critical to the Manhattan. It really helps kick up the flavors of the spicy rye that is, again, 30% rye content in a New Riff bourbon. So stirring this up now. A cocktail comprised only, by the way, of alcohol like this, of liquors or liqueurs or just no fruit juice is something that you do stir. You don't shake these kind of things. When you add fruit juice is when you get into the shaking. And we're going to pour this on the rocks. You can pour it straight up or on rocks. I drink them both ways, but we're going to go rocks tonight and pour out this luscious libation. And finally, our garnish is a remarkable thing. It's a real maraschino cherry. Note the pronunciation, not maraschino. This is an Italian maraschino cherry. It's made by the Luxardo firm. They are a producer of Luxardo maraschino liqueur in Padova, Italy, not too far from Venice. You know, when garnishing with a cocktail, you're supposed to put 1 or 3 things, 1 olive or 3, never 2, 1 cherry or 3. And because I love these cherries, I'm going to add 3. Eat these cherries. They will be the first, I swear to you, the first cherry of the rest of your life. You will never be able to put another cherry in a cocktail. So that is a New Riff Manhattan with the best cherry in the world. And by the way, I'd like to give a shout out to the fact that our whiskey being bottled without chill filtration. That means that all the aroma, all the flavor, all the texture is preserved from the barrel all the way to your glass. And that comes out beautifully in a cocktail because all those flavors, the fact that it's also 100 proof being bottled in bond, they carry and they sustain all the way through the experience of drinking the cocktail. It's nice to make a cocktail with a stronger whiskey, but it's especially nice to make one that is unchill filtered and additional flavors come out of the whiskey as it sits there and is diluted and also interacts with the vermouth and other ingredients, the bitters. So cheers, Nicholas, fellow history buff. And I hope you all are enjoying your New Riff Manhattan. Very nice.
Whenever we're off of here, I'm going in the next room. That's where all my New Riff is. So I'll be catching up with you.
Thank you, Nick.
So are there any questions? I don't know. I mean, I guess we could just ask each other questions here. I can't actually read chat. So if there's any questions in chat, lay them on us, Scott.
Yeah, well, thank you, Nick. So first of all, Jay, thanks for showing us how to do a Manhattan the right way. Those, once you've had those cherries, you'll never have any other cherries. Absolutely. And so we do have some questions, mostly comments about your presentation, what a thorough job you did as far as covering the history of bourbon very completely. You know, if we have anyone from outside of our viewing area or normal viewing area, they need to understand, and they do now, thanks to your presentation, about the importance of bourbon to the Commonwealth and to Kentucky. So we did have some comments about really, since we didn't completely introduce you, Nick, if you would just kind of give us a little rundown of what brought you to actually this presentation and what brought you to the archaeology that you did over at Buffalo Trace. Sure.
Yeah, so I came back to Kentucky. I was born and raised here, kind of settled as an Army brat. And I came to UK to start a PhD, and I was doing something that wasn't in Kentucky. My long-term goal was to settle here, have some sort of job where I could raise family, etc., and landed at the Heritage Council the same time that I really started doing some field work in bourbon, just kind of like getting my little toes in the water, right? As the bourbon world does, the project kind of took a life of its own. The Jewett House was the first stab at this, right? it started making headlines. We showed up in the New York Times at one point. The bourbon documentary happened, and then one day, Buffalo Trace called me, and they're like, "Hey, we hear you're doing this sort of stuff. We found something old. Do you want to come and check it out?" And the first time I actually ignored the call because I get a lot of calls like that from people who are like, "I'm something old," and they called back a few hours later, gave me a weekend there in the very first discovery of Bourbon Pompeii, where they didn't know what it was or anything. And I got to sit there and draw the profiles, and I saw like the really old deposits. I realized there was something buried underneath that lined up with their Sanborn maps. And when I was talking to the project team and Mark Brown about it, the desire for them to just kind of turn it into an event space kind of went away, and our direction became dig to China. My weekend turned into about a year and a half or so of doing the excavation with them and developing it into that indoor exhibit. That, I don't know, something like 110,000 people went through that distillery in 2019. So there's a lot there. One thing led to another, and I think it might have been you, Tim Niddle, on this call, that somebody invited me over to Midway, and they're like, "Do you want to start teaching as part of our university course, doing bourbon studies?" And I designed a 16-week bourbon history class that I teach with them now. So I still got the day job at the Heritage Council, but the bourbon archaeology, the kind of doing this public digs and talking with folks like you is what really keeps me in the field. You know, I mean, I got into archaeology for stuff like this, not for, you know, paperwork, though that is important as well.
I remember that, Nick. Actually, that was our mutual dean, Mark Gill, who reached out to you to expand the Bourbon Studies program over at Midway University. And I actually had the opportunity, even though I teach part of the Bourbon Studies program, to take Nick's Bourbon Archeology course, which is fantastic. So it was a little bit of a refresher for me, this presentation, but then a lot of new material as well. There's a question in the chat I wanted to relay to Nick and to Jay. Christopher Myers asks, "I heard that bourbon is only made in Kentucky. Is that true? Is it that there's something special in our groundwater?" And I'll turn it over to both of you. Nick, you want to get started with that?
I think that it would be a true fact to say all good bourbon is made in Kentucky. There's a few outliers. There's some good bourbon outside Kentucky, but I think we make something like 95% of the world's bourbon here in the Commonwealth. So there is that perception. If we're going to be honest about it, we have to definitely say that bourbon is a native spirit of the United States. Any of the states, any of the territories, if you adhere to the characteristics that make bourbon bourbon, you can still technically call it bourbon. As soon as you cross a border, Mexico, Canada, Japan, whatever, you can no longer call it bourbon. You want to correct me or challenge me on any of that, Jay?
No, you're quite correct. Bourbon can be made anywhere in America, the 50 states. You could probably make it, and in fact, there are some distilleries in the District of Columbia. I think that's still bourbon. So yeah, 50 states can make bourbon, and at this point, with the explosion of distilling over the past 15, 20, 25 years, I think there's a bourbon distillery probably in every state. To the point of the groundwater, that's yes, truth, but also a bit of legend. The fact is, almost all of Kentucky's distilleries, the big ones, run on city water today. They don't run on the myth that their marketing teams often promote, which is a burbling brook of beautiful water with moonbeams shining on it, and it's being gathered every morning by virgins in silver chalices. This is the tale that they tell. And in fact, most of them run on city water, and they make great bourbon. They make fantastic bourbon on that city water. In fact, at New Riff, as I mentioned, we do run on a private groundwater, and we're one of the few Kentucky distilleries left that do. But historically, it's absolutely correct that Kentucky's rich supply of groundwater, the branches and springs, indeed, Kentucky is awash with good native water supplies. To a settler here 200 and 250 years ago, that was where you put your farm. You moved to Kentucky, you looked for, where do I put my farm? I need a supply of water. And indeed, the many sites that Nick explores and that I've been to myself out in the woods to see the stoneworks, they're always located on a water supply. And so it is absolutely true in history that Kentucky's groundwater supply did provide for the distilling industry that sprang up here. I can't speak to whether it really makes the horse's bones better, but it is true that it helped situate the farms in the places that they did. They had groundwater that either supplied directly to a distillery, or as Nick was pointing out in some of his digs, that allowed the owner of a farm to build a mill race to divert water from a groundwater source into the farm, the sort of industrial, proto-industrial area of the farm, and get that groundwater going to make whiskey. But today they almost all run on city water.
And to build on that a little bit, like you mentioned, like you've been out and you've seen the stone ruins for some of these other distilleries. I mean, I do not think that it's exaggerating to say that at one point Kentucky had probably thousands of distilleries. If you count the moonshine stills, the farm distilleries, the industrial distilleries, there is all sorts of stuff out there. And with different kind of bourbon focused projects, it just kind of starts coming out of the woodworks where somebody has a collection, or they have a picture, or they know where a moonshine site has been. And it's another thing, it makes the projects take a life of its own on. But that information is also something that we can actually distill, I guess, pun intended, right? You can actually take some of those stories and package it with, say, special runs of bourbons or whatnot, as far as like fundraisers, what have you, get more tourists in the door. Because as the folks in the audience know, you know, our heritage tourism, that population, they stay longer, they spend more money, they are brought in by the bourbon, by the interest in the history, and then you just take your hooks and, like, if you're interested in the bourbon, come over here or drive out to Maysville, and while you're on your way to Old Pogue, stop by these places, you know. It is amazing how all of this kind of interlocks.
I think we've got time for one more question, so I want to throw this out to both of you to wrap it up. What is your personal favorite way to drink bourbon? Jay, you want to start us?
Sure. Well, as I alluded to before, if I can get my hands on an unchill filtered bourbon like New Riff, a bourbon bottled without filtration, or any other whiskey, certainly many scotches and so on are bottled without chill filtration. That's where this quality standard really came from. I enjoy drinking the most of all, just straight up, no ice, but with that splash of water. I like to smell the whiskey straight and then perhaps try it straight up without water, and then hit it with that water and see that additional flavors and additional aromas come out of the glass as it is interacting with that water. That's true of any whiskey, but particularly true of an unfiltered whiskey, an unchill filtered whiskey. They are highly reactive with water, a whiskey bottled unfiltered, and can often bloom up with different flavors that you would miss if the only way you ever drink it is straight. Personally, I find that ice, although I enjoy ice, of course, in cocktails, and I love me plenty of whiskey cocktails, ice on a straight bourbon, this is my personal opinion, it just like anything, it tamps down some of the aroma. The analogy I use is which smells more delicious, a chicken out of the refrigerator or a chicken out of the oven? And when you chill something, you still down really the molecular activity going on, in this case, in the glass. And so I prefer it no ice, but I do hit it with a little water. As I said before, drink your bourbon any way you want, just make it New Riff.
Awesome. Yeah, I think I drink mine very similar. Like I like to start neat. I'll add a little bit of water. I think that the extra element that I would add on is I like to keep a bourbon journal. What's been going on that day? What food I had, right? Because I think we probably all experienced this. A product, say your favorite bourbon, say you're drinking the New Riff Bottled and Bond, right? It tastes different if you're doing some angry drinking after a really rough week. You're exhausted. You're just like, oh my God, work was horrible, versus taking a break, relaxing, celebrating, and it's interesting keeping the notes of I'm tasting these things and this stuff happened today, going back in a different time, different mood, different food, and seeing how the bourbon tastes different, because the spirit itself is not changing. It's your experience. All of that is changing and it's influencing the things that you pick up on. And I really like that aspect. It's kind of a zen, like being in the moment type of thing, only bourbon's involved, so it's even better.
That's great. Thank you both. Well, I have just enough left. I saved my new riff for tonight. So I think I'm going to go off and make it in Manhattan and document it in my journal that I had a great, enjoyable evening here tonight. So thank you both.
Well,
Sure, Tim.
and on behalf of the NKY Restoration Committee, the communities we represent, we want to give a great shout out. That's one of the things about virtual is we don't get to applaud. So, we want to make sure that we applaud for all of our presenters tonight. We've had some great topics, some great talks. I want to thank Tim and Jay and Nick for the work that areas than just our central area. So we're very excited for this. So thank you all for that, especially and for the wonderful bourbon that we had. I'm fortunate I live in Newport, so I get to say with pride that we have New Riff from one side of town to the other. So, and Nick, thank you. Always a pleasure to hear from you. Stay tuned for tomorrow. In the chat, we have to the Eventbrite for the rest of the restoration weekend. Take a look at the schedule. Join us Saturday and Sunday. This is a true restoration weekend. So cheers, everybody. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Scott. See you all later. I'm sure I'll see some of you around the beeline. Have a great night.
Thank you.